So with that, I am excited and happy to introduce Judy Nollet, today's presenter.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jay. I appreciate that. And I want to give a shout out to Fredrickson just for sharing and hosting this group, taking care of all the logistics for us and whatnot. I think that's really great of them. For those who don't know me, I do business as White Plume Communications, hence the hat, though Zoom isn't sure whether to blur out the feather or not. I have been working with Articulate Products, since around 2010, 2011, so before Storyline. I don't really consider myself an expert and I'm not an e-learning hero, but I sometimes play one on the forum. So I'm going to give you my best shot of some of the just things I like about it, tips, tricks, kind of covering for all levels of users. So be patient. If you don't understand something, maybe eventually it'll make sense. I am going to, if I can, turn off my video.
And as Judy's getting started, we will have time for questions at the end, and feel free to chat some questions during the session. And she may or may not have time to answer them during the presentation, but there will be time for questions at the end as well. Thanks again, Judy.
Yeah, I'm not really going to be paying attention to chat as I'm presenting, but if something seems really urgent, Jay, you can break in, I guess.
Sounds good. Thank you.
So I turned off my video, but you all get to see me via this avatar today. I admit that I don't actually look like this. For one thing, my hair is never that styled, which is just one of the reasons why my hat is so handy. And I'm not that thin. However, I do have gray hair and glasses. And I think I have that sweater, but in a slightly different shade of blue. So why the crossed arms? I recently read a Lorna Landvik novel, and she referred to that as the Minnesota State pose. And I thought, you betcha. So you might be wondering about the G Storyline title. Well, that covers the G's that someone might say when working in Storyline. Gee, I never noticed that, but it's actually easy to overlook some of the helpful features. Or, gee, I hadn't thought about that. But there are different ways to get the same things done. And gee, I hate to ask, but we all need help sometimes. Let's start by looking at some of Storyline's features that often go unnoticed. And one of those areas is the player. I'll open that up. And let's go to the menu. The overlooked but absolutely vital part of this section is this reset from story button at the bottom. Now, in all likelihood, you are apt to move some of your slides around when you're building a course. And unfortunately, the built-in menu doesn't always keep up with your changes. For example, you can see here that a lot of the numbers are out of order and some aren't even in the right scene. So this handy dandy button lets me rebuild the menu based on the current order of my slides. Now, when I reset a menu, it does include everything, even if I've previously deleted those items from the menu. So for example, I didn't have scenes 5 and 6 in there before, so I can select delete and say, yes, remove it and remove the children, which is the slides underneath the heading. So those two are gone. And if I don't like making a whole big fancy section about this beginning, I'll delete that heading, but keep the children. And if I want the menu, which looks kind of forbidding here when you see everything, to appear collapsed, I can just do that here. And that's how it's going to show up when somebody opens the course. Text labels. This is another overlooked spot. But it's very important because it holds all of the text that Storyline uses in its warning messages and default messages and, even the player buttons, etc. And the nice thing is that you can actually change that. So for example, there it is. If I want the correct header in all my quiz questions to say, way to go, it's as simple as that to change it here. And by the way, for those of you who work on courses that get translated, this is where you would change the player text to a different language. These labels are not exported when you export for translation. So you've got to make that change here, or the course might be in another language, but the messages are going to show up in English. There are actually some player customizations that can be done at the slide level. For example, this screenshot is of a question slide that doesn't show the menu, even though it was set up in the same course as this one. So how do I accomplish that? I open slide properties. That's this button down here in the lower right. Player features, custom for selected slides. When I select that, I can see various features and select or deselect them as I want. What's appropriate for a given slide. So very handy for customizing a given slide now and then. Let's talk about layers versus the base. For those of you who have worked in Storyline, have you ever been frustrated by how to hide only some objects on the base when you show a layer? For example, well, what do? Typical method is to add a shape that covers the base, but as this shows, it's not always possible to completely cover everything that you want to get rid of. Wouldn't you rather have something really clean like that? Well, here's how to hide only some items on the base, and it is something I overlooked for a long time. In the timeline for a layer, you can actually expand the base layer section. Now, I can't edit these items from here, but I can deselect any eye icon to make those items appear or disappear only when the layer is shown. And by the way, in case you didn't notice before, this button, when I'm on a layer, will open slide layer properties. And this actually includes a checkbox to hide everything on the base for when that's appropriate. Especially when you're starting out in Storyline, I highly recommend just taking some time, to step through the various slide layer properties, slide properties, and player properties, so you don't overlook a feature that might save you tons of time. Now let's look at some overlooked drop-downs. I hate to admit how long it took me to notice the scenes drop-down. That's this one up here. When I'm editing, this lets me quickly change to any other scene or even go to a question bank, whatever you want to call it. There is one disadvantage though, and that's that this always goes just to the first slide in the selected scene, which is why I tend to still use these open tabs along the top, because I could move between specific slides if I wanted to. Now, I hope you all already know about this one, but I'm going to mention it because in the forum, I see quite a few people using triggers to change an object state to hidden or disabled when the timeline starts. And then they need a variable and condition so that only happens the first time a user comes to the slide. Well, if I go to states, select this object, it's so much easier to use this drop down and just say, oh, you know what? I want this one to be hidden at the start or disabled or any other state that's available. Now, I know some longtime Storyline users who've never noticed this one, the select dropdown. Let me show you that in action by previewing this scene. Should have Mark play the Jeopardy theme song while these things come up.
See what I can do.
So select, this actually lets me jump to any of the slides that I've previewed. I can also jump out and preview something else, but if I stay within the ones that I have been previewed, I can jump around without needing to use the navigation. So for example, if I want to check something, slides that maybe have buttons that connect each other, but not navigation, that's really handy to just go from one to the other. And for those of you who use Storyline 3, this is especially handy because Storyline 3 makes you preview an entire scene or the entire course. And let's go back here. Finally, I'm going to expand or show you one that I just learned about last month. Now, I hope that most of you have already seen the little drop downs here that let you expand groups so that you can see the individual items in a group. What you may not have noticed is that one of those arrows appears whenever you animate text, so animations, by paragraph. That little drop down will expand it to show each of the paragraphs as a separate item. Now, I've added these shapes that are going to appear at 1 second intervals, just so you can see the time pass as we preview this slide. Notice how each paragraph comes on as soon as the previous one is there, but what do you want to do if you want that slowed down? Well, that's where these come in. I can actually change these and move them like I do other items on timelines to adjust their start points. So for example, set them at 2 second intervals. Look at this again. Ta-da! The animations are slowed down. Now, personally, if I had to present this text, I'd prefer to put each bullet point into its own shape that could be timed as needed, kind of like the numbers on this slide. Why? Because then the text wouldn't look like bullet points. But it's still a handy trick to know, just in case. Now let's look at a few development tips. I'm going to start with some basic ones that you've maybe heard before, but that are worth repeating. First and foremost, get organized. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at what I call a disorganized slide. It has the default names for all the objects and the layers. It also has a programming error, but it'd be very hard to spot it just by looking at the slide in this edit mode. Here's the same slide, but organized. I gave all the objects and layers meaningful names. For this type of interaction, basic click tells with layers, I like to start button names with B and a number, and then I start the layers with L and a number. I also include a bit of description, because that's going to help me see what's what when I'm developing. But I know that B1 goes to L1, B2 goes to L2, and so it's really easy to see that B3 is where the error is. And I'd be much less likely to even make a mistake like that if these names were in place from the start. So cannot stress that too much. You might also have noticed that I rearranged items on the timeline. So there's this nice cascading effect. Whenever possible, I like to arrange items so that the order they appear from bottom to top on the timeline matches the order they will appear on the slide. It just makes it much easier to adjust their entry points without getting confused. Now I'll mention something you find in virtually all of my projects, a storage scene. As this screenshot shows, you can have a scene that isn't included in the standard navigation. It's standalone scene. I use this to hold all sorts of stuff. For example, if I have a slide that has a really special setup and I might want to duplicate that throughout the course, or slides that the client said to delete, but that I want to keep around just in case they change their mind, or slides that will be lightboxed. If only it were this easy to store stuff in the real world. Have you ever returned to one of your interactive slides and wondered, gee, how did I do that? Or, gee, what does that variable do? I know I have. That's why I also recommend adding programming notes. For something simple, I just had a short note in a shape that is off the slide, like this one. Or if it's a temporary reminder that the slide still needs some editing before publishing, I do put a note on the slide itself. I make it nice, big, and bright so that it's even visible here in the thumbnail. And that makes it really easy for me to spot which slides still need work. It's also possible to use the notes panel in the, fine as long as you're not showing the notes in the player for the course. Can't use images here. And you have to be careful if the course is going to be translated. Tell them not to translate your notes. But that is a possibility for some of your programming info. Other options. Suppose you have a really complicated slide, kind of like this one, triggers with variables and conditions. Now, if I had to hand this off to a colleague, it might be hard for them to figure out how I programmed it. Or, I might have to figure that out again if I return to the slide later to do an update. So here's that same slide, and I used layers for my programming notes. They're available to any developer who's using the slide, but they're never shown to anyone taking the course. Again, if the course had to be available in other languages, I'd have to make sure that the translation folks didn't translate this text and actually charge me for doing that. But it is nice for single language courses, handy, very visible. And then one other option too, which I have done, is just create a separate file with just the interaction slide and then extra slides that have your notes. You just have to remember where you put that file. Whatever method you use, I think you're going to find it's worth the effort to create those programming notes. I think it's important to master the player and play with the masters. So I'm going to talk about doing easy math on the master layouts, talk a little bit about controlling master objects. We'll look at adding extras to the question layout, and then I'm going to demo how to add custom player tabs. We'll start with the slide master, which I access from the View tab. Now, this is the default slide layout. I don't know why the text boxes were made at this size or this placement. Like, why is the slide title 864 pixels wide and 22 pixels from the top? Just as an example, this layout ends up with the same text placement as the other one, but an edge-to-edge setup makes it easier to reposition items on the slides if a text box gets moved accidentally. So in this particular case, it's still an ugly layout, but at least it would be easier to work with. And in case anyone out there isn't familiar with adjusting these indentations, I'll show you how to do that. I'm on the Format tab. I click that button to open Format Shape. go down to text box, and this is where I can set my margins. By the way, as much as possible, I like to size objects in increments of 5 or 10. For example, the slides in this file are 540 pixels high. I made the title text box 70 pixels high. So now I know that anything that needs to fill the space under the title should be 470 pixels. I just find it's easier to do the math when the numbers all end in 5 or 0. And that applies to objects I put on the slides too. And here's something else to keep in mind when working with masters. Notice that this header is set up with a solid blue rectangle and a text box here that is pulled just so it starts to the right of my logo. Now, after what I said a moment ago, you might be wondering why I didn't simply use a solid text box for the title and then move its margin, adjust that to the right of the logo. Well, I'll show you. This slide is set up that way. Solid text box. There's my logo. Notice that it is above the text here in the timeline. I'll close the master. Let's see what happens if I apply that layout. Suddenly my logo is gone. I can't see it, even though the title is at the bottom of the timeline. Well, if I move the title text box, yep, my logo is still there. The issue is that, except for placeholders, the objects I insert on a master layout can't be edited or even moved on a slide. These kinds of objects are permanent. And because placeholders like the title or other text placeholders are editable and movable, they will appear above those permanent objects, even if that's not how they're arranged on the master timeline. So keep that in mind when you're planning your masters. And by the way, master, oops, I selected the wrong one. By the way, the master feedback layouts work that way too. So for example, correct and incorrect have certain objects like this that cannot be moved, even though I could actually move those text responses. So if I wanted this out of the way, because I didn't want it to cover responses, I can't do that with this layout. I could, however, just switch to a blank layout, and then all of these items are movable. Let's apply that correct layout again. Oops. Oh, there we go. Switch this back because I want to show one other thing about the master feedback layers in the new modern player. Notice that the background, the slide is dimmed. Now I don't have the dim button checked. That's not what's doing it. I've seen this issue crop up in the forum where somebody is wondering, why is my base dimmed? Why can't I see the base from these layers or even other layers that they've created? Well, it has to do with the feedback master, which is also accessed from the View tab. If I go to Background Styles, Format Background, I can see that it's got a solid fill that's partially transparent. That is what's dimming the base. If you don't want that kind of dimming, you would have to come and select No Fill. Close that out. Let's go back to the slide masters and look at the master question layout. This layout is, to put it politely, a bit quirky. For example, suppose I want to show the question number at the bottom of the slide. I would, of course, insert a placeholder for that. But let's look at what happens now if I insert a new question slide. We'll do a quick true, false. Of course, I get form view first. Go to slide view. And that is obviously not what I wanted at all. My responses are down here. And this is ready for me to enter something. Oops. Let's go back to that layout. Here's the thing. When you put extra text boxes on a question layout, you need to move them below the two default text boxes in the timeline, the question title and question choice. That's because Storyline is just going to grab the top two items for the question and responses. So I have moved this to the bottom. Now, if I insert a new question, the question's where it's supposed to be, the responses are where they're supposed to be, and I have my text box to say that this is question 1 of 4 or whatever. Okay. Here is one more tip for using the player. We'll go there. Now, you've probably seen the built-in resources. It lets you link to any websites or attach files. But this is really limited space for naming the files. And there is no space here for explaining why a given link might be useful. Frankly, I like to give learners more context for the resources so they know in advance if a link is worth clicking. So here's what I do. First, I want to get rid of the built-in resources. Now, I can't delete it, but I can simply deselect it here so it's not going to show up in the player. Next, I click the add icon. That's going to let me add an item to the player. I will name it resources because that's a fine name. Quick tip, if your course does have multiple tabs up here and you'd like to spread them out a bit, just include a couple of spaces before and after the name. And you can also add spaces around the names of the built-in tabs by going where? Text labels that I showed you earlier. Okay, now I'm going to program this tab to lightbox a slide that I have already created in my storage scene. Click OK. Close the player. Let's go and preview this scene. Here's resources. And when I click, my slide comes up as a light box. I could fill this slide with whatever I want to show that the list of resources, descriptions of the resources, just any kind of information that might help people decide, do they want to click or not? This trick can also be used if you have a custom glossary, a help slide, or any other information that you want to be available throughout the course. All right, let's move on now and talk about fulfilling shapes. In other words, filling shapes with pictures instead of colors. The top half of this slide shows some original images, and the bottom shows those images filling rectangles. For example, I had a client that had custom icons which were all square. I should probably point out that these are not their icons, but they do work the same way. Now, for each state of this button, I could have filled it with different colors and then pasted an icon and moved it into the proper position on the left. That is an option. But instead, I created these images at the top simply by extending the width of each icon. And for simple math, these images have a 1:4 aspect ratio so that they perfectly fill a 1:4 rectangle to create a button. Now, if I needed a longer button, I could adjust the width of the images to ensure that the icon would always stay square. The two examples here in the middle show how to get banded rectangles. For this trick, you can use just a small image, and the program is going to expand it to fill the rectangle. So for example, this image looks like this when it's expanded. And even if I adjust the width, whoops, not move it, adjust, I really wish they would make these easier to grab. Adjust the width, maybe I'll try this one. Adjust the width, it's still going to look the same. This one, if I adjust its width, that does affect this band and obviously affects my margins. So I wouldn't want to do that. But I can adjust the height and keep the banding looking the same. This final example is filled with photos. Now again, I could simply insert a photo, but then I'd have to add a text box over it to get a label. Instead, I filled the rectangle with the photos and adjusted the margins so that the rectangle's text appears where I want it. Now, filling a shape with a picture isn't always the best option, but I think it's definitely something to consider. And now it's time for one of my favorite tricks, the incredible invisible layer. This is like a typical custom menu slide. It's got buttons to access the topics. We look at the timeline, you'll notice that there's some audio and the buttons don't appear right away. Now, I would not want to make the user listen to the audio again and wait for the buttons to appear every time they return to the menu. To prevent that from happening, I'd set the slide properties to resume save state when revisiting. So the timeline won't replay when the user comes back to the slide. But I also want to disable the next button until the user has finished every topic. That's something that's typically done with triggers that check true-false variables when the timeline starts. Well, so how can I do that if the slide's timeline isn't going to restart? Simple. I can put the triggers I need on a layer like this one. Now this layer is blank, so it's not covering anything on the base, but the triggers will run. And I can set the slide layer properties to reset to initial state when revisiting. That means the timeline will replay every time the user comes back to that layer. And yes, that can be different. Does not have to match what the setting is on the base. Now, all I would need to do is add a trigger to show that layer when the timeline starts on this slide. When the user visits the slide for the first time, the layer will open. There is no trigger to close it, so it stays open. The layer's timeline will replay, so the triggers will always run without the user having to sit through the base timeline again. You can also use invisible layers to program looping actions. For example, we'll preview this slide. This dial has 60 positions. Now it's moving through them on its own because its variable is being adjusted by triggers. To do that, you might think I'd need 60 triggers to adjust the variable step by step, but I save myself a lot of work by using looping layers instead. I have 2 layers with triggers. In the first layer, the first trigger adds 1 to the variable for the dial as soon as the timeline starts. The second trigger shows the other layer when the timeline reaches 1/10 of a second. Notice that both of these triggers have a condition, so it will only run until the variable reaches 60, which is the highest point on this dial. The second layer basically has the same triggers, except that this one shows first layer when it reaches 1/10 of a second. One of the nice things about this method is that it'd be easy to update if I change the increments on the dial just by editing the upper value of the conditions. The point is to keep in mind that layers can do stuff, even if they don't show stuff. And speaking of invisible, a learner won't see objects that are off the slide, but those objects can still be useful. As an example, this is my blank layout. The slide is an open canvas waiting for me to add something interesting. It's got a long wait. But while the slide is blank, the area outside is not. Notice the slide title just above. That's where I put the placeholder on the master blank layout. This allows me to enter an official name for the slide by typing in this text box, which is much easier than selecting it down here and typing it in this limited space. And even when not using the built-in menu, I find it's helpful to have good titles just for reference. Learners are never going to see what's off the slide, but Storyline always does. So for example, you can also include buttons that are controlled by triggers. And I've used those in some of the demos I posted on the forum. Some more complicated things like how to track custom questions and surveys and whatnot. I will post a link to that later in, after I finish the presentation, because my profile page also has some more complicated development tips that I really don't have time to cover today. So I hope all those tips make your development easier. But let's discuss those, gee, I hate to ask, but I need some help moments. When working in Storyline, there are a lot of things you need to get right. I've put the main areas you need to get right into what I call the 8-fold path. Now I'm going to be presenting about this at 10 a.m. on December 16th as part of an Articulate webinar. And I will give you the registration link to that at the end of this presentation. For more about help, though, you can get lots of it from Articulate, and it all can start here in the Help tab. Click the Tutorials button. Guess what? That goes to the Getting Started page for Storyline. Now from here, you can access training, which includes the recorded videos and webinars for those who have a 360 license. Personally, I highly recommend the user guide. Go here, bookmark it. Many of the questions that I see in the forum are already answered here. It's worth the time to just look through it when you need help with how does Storyline work? What does a given button do? What happens on a certain screen? And by the way, you can access all the user guides from this Learn dropdown. Notice that they have guides for all the software. And so even if you're using Storyline 3, you can get a guide specifically for that. Now I'll give you my quick tips for getting answers in the forum. First, try searching to see if your question has already been asked and answered. Because then if you find your answer, great. If you find something sort of related, but it doesn't answer your question, I'd say it's probably best to start a new discussion. That is more likely to get noticed than an extra comment on an old discussion. Be aware that the forum doesn't include tagging. I mean, yes, you can enter the @ symbol followed by someone's name, but that doesn't actually notify them, nor will replying to someone's comment. And not everybody automatically subscribes to posts, which means they don't get emails when there's a new comment added. In short, just don't assume that a given person is going to see your comment and respond. Fortunately, your chances of having someone respond are pretty good because it's a really strong community. When you do start a new discussion, put it in the proper category. For example, if you've got a general question about best practices for e-learning, put that under building better courses. If you've got a question about how to do something in Storyline, put that in the Storyline category. And if you've got something happening that's like completely wonky, I suggest you just submit it directly to the support staff to save time. Use a clear headline. A title that says, "I need help," doesn't tell me anything if I'm looking to answer questions. And it doesn't help others who are searching for the answer to the same question. So try to include some basic information and key terms in the title, like problem with branching scenarios or controlling button states on a custom menu. Give a detailed description. That advice should be obvious, but I have seen quite a few posts where I'm not sure what they're asking about. So explain, what do you want to do? What have you already tried? What's happening that shouldn't happen? And what's not happening that should happen? Upload a Storyline file. Now, sometimes when I'm answering questions, I can tell from the description what's probably going wrong, but often it is impossible to troubleshoot without seeing the file. If one slide has a problem, then make a copy of the file with just that slide, or with as few slides as possible. If it's got proprietary content, that's no excuse. Just change the text to blah, 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 or yada, yada, yada. And please, please, please give your objects, layers, variables, and motion paths meaningful names before you ask for help. Finally, remember to say thank you. Those of us who answer questions in the forum don't do it for the accolades, but it is nice when someone says that an answer was helpful. So that's it for now. As I said, I've got quite a few tips on my profile page. Where is chat? I'll enter that. So you can copy, and I will show you. Looks like this. Let's get this out of the way. Chat, move it. Why won't it let me move it? Oh, well. That's my profile page. Lots of different tips on things you can accomplish. And then for those who might want to attend the webinar on December 16th, there's a link to that. Just put it in the chat. I'll show it to you here. Now, I will point out that the Articulate marketing team decided that it should be called Ensure Smooth Sailing in Storyline by following 8 pro tips. Rest assured that if you sign up for that title, you will see the 8-fold path to a Storyline file that works. All right. Thanks for being here. We've got time for questions. Let's go.
Questions, anyone? There's a few
Questions?
minutes
You
left.
can- Oh, now it's moving.
Could you show me where the user guide is again?
Absolutely, because I am a big fan of the user guides. If you go to the forums and just about any of the Articulate sites, you learn, discuss, and downloads, learn Articulate tutorials and user guides. And you can get to their tutorials or get to the user guides. Find it once, bookmark it. I've got that bookmarked. I've got the request feature because I always tell them what I want them to change. I've got submitting a case bookmarked. Yeah, lots of useful stuff. The fill image technique. Oh, sure. So where was that? when you've got a shape, actually, let's start with a blank slide. Anytime you add a shape, the default tends to be, a certain color from your palette. But again, if I go to format and open the format shape, and similar to PowerPoint, I can say there's no fill, solid fill, gradient fill, or I can say fill it with a picture. And then it's just a matter of saying, well, what picture do I want? And so here, for example, I had that banded rectangle. And it just stretches it. So whatever picture you have, it will be stretched to fill the shape. Plan accordingly. But that becomes a really nice possibility. And particularly, like if you wanted to have free-form question responses and have it look like that, separating the A, B, C, D from the actual response. Other questions? Glad to see that people are finding things useful. And yes, it's easy to overlook things. Like I say, I have overlooked some of the things. How do you add page numbers to your slide master? I never do actually, but I know if you're in 360, you'll see, and I don't have my variables showing. Built-in variables do include sections viewed, slide number, etc. Anytime you want to show a variable, all right, let's go to a slide master. Actually, probably would insert text. And then I would say insert reference. Reference means I'm going to show a variable, slide number. Okay. Those references, those slide numbers tend to come up and they look yellow, but they aren't. That's just to show you that it's a reference, that it's an inserted variable and not an actual piece of text. And yes, I am using 360 today. Most, if not, probably all of what I have shown today applies to Storyline 3.2. You can still fill shapes with pictures. You can still do math and control objects works the same. Question layout works the same. You can still add custom player tabs. You can still do stuff on your layers. None of this is 360 specific. Anyway, I do appreciate y'all showing up. And good luck with your storyline work. As I said, the forum is really a helpful place to go. So when you've got questions that aren't answered in the user guide, definitely come here. Great.
Well, then let me just jump in and say thank you to Judy. I used your tip, Judy. I did the thank you. I wrote the thank you because you said to say thank you to people in the user guide. And I've seen a lot of people do the thank yous already. But please feel free to either say thank you or do the hand clap or the thumbs up on the reactions and let Judy know that you appreciate her time. We will be having our Twin Cities user group for Articulate in 2022. I expect we will have somewhere between 3 to 6 sessions, and I expect that at least the start of the year will be virtual. We may at some point try a live event again, a 1 or 2, but kind of the long-term vision for this, I expect that primarily a lot of the sessions will be virtual, but when we get back to where we can do in-person meetings, that there might be 1 or 2 in-person meetings over the course of the year as well. So thank you to all of you for taking your time out of your day to spend it with us. And again, thank you to Judy. Great session. And you will get a link to the session with your thank you note for this meeting as well. So that's it. Have a great afternoon, everyone.